The last coin in Eli Calloway's pocket was a dull, worn thing, rubbed so smooth by years of hard luck that the eagle on its face had nearly disappeared, and he stood on the sun-bleached platform of Dustcreek Station on the afternoon of July the 14th, 1883, watching the westbound train breathe its last cloud of steam, and wondering what kind of man spent his final cent on a wildflower for a woman he had never met. The answer, he would later decide, was exactly the kind of man he had always been and never known how to stop being. The train had come in 20 minutes late, which was nothing unusual for the Southern Pacific Line out of San Antonio. The platform at Dustcreek, Texas, was a modest affair. Raw pine planks gone gray from 3 years of brutal sun, a covered waiting area with 2 benches that had lost most of their paint, and a small depot building where the station master, old Clarence Hobbs, kept a ledger, and a potbelly stove he fired even in July because his bones ached from an old arrow wound he had received at the Nueces River back in '63. The town of Dustcreek itself sat roughly a quarter-mile from the station, a collection of perhaps 200 souls who had built their lives around the cattle trade and a modest silver operation in the hills to the northwest. It was not a glamorous place, but it was a functioning one, and on this July afternoon it had sent a modest delegation to the station. Eli had come to meet his employer's new supply shipment, 3 crates of hardware and 2 barrels of nails ordered from a merchant in San Antonio for the half-built barn on the Hadley Ranch where Eli had been working as a hand for 7 months. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, and lean in the way men get when they work hard and eat just enough. His hat was a brown felt thing with a dent in the crown that he had never bothered to knock out, and his boots had been resoled twice. He owned the clothes on his back, a bedroll, a pocket knife, a photograph of his mother taken in Missouri before the war, and 1 coin. He watched the other people on the platform with the particular idle attention of a man who has time before his crates are unloaded. There was a family of 4 come to meet a grandmother, the children already shrieking and running toward the woman who appeared at the top of the car steps with her arms spread wide. There was Carl Briggs from the livery, come to collect a new horse that had been shipped up from a breeder in Laredo. There was Reverend Poole, who met every train on the off chance it carried a letter from his son in Missouri, which it rarely did. And then there was a woman who stepped off the last passenger car and stood at the top of the steps with a carpetbag in one hand and a small leather trunk at her feet, and she looked down at the platform with eyes that moved across every face gathered there, and nothing in those faces moved back toward her. No one was waiting for her. Eli noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar tune, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quietly, plainly off. Every other passenger who descended from those steps found someone within seconds, a hand raised, a name called, a body moving forward to close the distance. This woman descended the steps, set her trunk down on the platform, picked up her carpetbag, and stood in the July heat with no one coming. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark chestnut hair pulled back in a practical knot beneath a hat that had probably been nice when it was new. Her dress was a deep blue cotton, travel-worn, the hem dusted from the journey. She had brown eyes that were composed in the way that people who have learned not to show disappointment become composed, and she was not crying, which told Eli she had perhaps been expecting exactly this outcome, or had at least made peace with its possibility. She set her bag down, opened a small folded paper, read it, looked up at the street beyond the platform, and then looked back at the paper. Whatever she had expected to find written on it did not appear to be standing on the platform waiting for her. Eli became aware of 2 things simultaneously. One was that the woman was clearly stranded, or at minimum deeply uncertain of her next step. The other was that a small Mexican boy who sold flowers near the depot entrance had been watching the same scene and was now trotting toward the woman with a hopeful expression, and a bunch of what appeared to be Texas bluebells and yellow wildflowers gathered into a rough bouquet, held together with a piece of twine. The boy stopped in front of the woman and said, "Flowers, miss. 1 cent." The woman looked at the flowers, then at the boy, and Eli could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the same calculation he had made this morning when he counted what he had left. She opened her small purse, looked in it, and said something quiet to the boy that Eli could not hear, but he could read the gentle shake of her head. Eli looked down at his own palm, where the single coin lay catching the afternoon light. He was a practical man. He had been poor before, and he knew what a coin meant when it was the last one. He knew that a cent spent now was a cent he could not use tomorrow. He knew all of this, and he walked toward the flower boy anyway. "I'll take those," he said to the boy, and placed the coin in the small outstretched hand. The boy beamed, made the coin disappear into his pocket with the practiced ease of a child who understands the value of swift transactions, and pressed the bunch of wildflowers into Eli's hand before darting off toward the edge of the platform. Eli stood with the flowers and looked at the woman, who was now looking at him with an expression that had moved from composed surprise to something more guarded, more questioning. He crossed the 3 paces between them and held out the flowers. "Nobody ought to arrive somewhere new without something decent to look at," he said, and he meant it the way he said it, plainly, without ornament. "Welcome to Dustcreek." The woman looked at the flowers for a moment, then at him, and something in her expression shifted the way ice shifts in late March, not breaking open all at once but moving, giving. She took the flowers. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and steady, a southern cadence in it, Virginia maybe, or the Carolinas. "I'm afraid I don't know a soul here. I was meant to be met by a Mr. Arthur Pruitt." "Arthur Pruitt," Eli repeated, and he did not say what he knew about Arthur Pruitt immediately, because it was not good news and she was already standing on a hot platform with no welcome, and he wanted to give her at least a few more seconds of the flowers before he added to her difficulties. "I know the name. Do you know where I might find him? I have a letter here with his address, but I confess I don't know the town at all." Eli took a breath and decided honesty was the only real kindness he could offer her. "Arthur Pruitt sold his property here in March," he said carefully. "He left for California. I don't know if he told anyone he was going, but I heard it from my employer. He moved on." The woman absorbed this. She looked at the letter in her hand, then at the flowers, then at some middle distance where she appeared to be reorganizing everything she had planned. "I see," she said. "Were you coming here to work for him, or as family?" She was quiet for a moment that carried its own weight. "Neither, exactly," she said. "He had advertised. I had answered the advertisement." Eli understood then. A matrimonial advertisement. And Arthur Pruitt, who had evidently not troubled himself to inform the woman he had invited across hundreds of miles that he had since decided to leave for California, had left her standing on this platform with a carpetbag and a trunk and a bunch of wildflowers from a stranger. The anger Eli felt was quiet and specific, the way a good man's anger tends to be. He did not direct it at her. He directed it precisely at its source, the carelessness of a man who treated a woman's journey and hope as something easily forgotten. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said, and meant it absolutely. "What's your name, if I may ask?" "Clara Voss," she said. "From Richmond, Virginia." "Eli Calloway," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I work out at the Hadley Ranch, but I know Dustcreek reasonably well. There's a boarding house on Main Street run by a widow named Mrs. Alding. It's clean, the rates are fair, and she doesn't tolerate trouble. You'd be safe and comfortable there while you decide what to do next." Clara Voss looked at him for a long moment, and he had the feeling she was not simply evaluating his trustworthiness but performing a much larger calculation about whether to trust the world at all, having just been given excellent reasons not to. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Calloway," she said finally. "I'll walk you there," he said. "Just let me see about my crates first." He retrieved his supply crates from the freight area, arranged for them to be loaded onto the Hadley wagon by one of the boys who worked the depot, and returned to where Clara stood with her trunk, still holding the wildflowers with a kind of careful deliberateness. as though she had decided they were worth holding properly. He picked up her trunk without making a ceremony of it, and she fell into step beside him, and they walked the quarter-mile into Dustcreek together in the dry July heat, while the afternoon began to lean toward evening, and Eli found that the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which surprised him, because silences with strangers usually were. Dustcreek in the summer of 1883 was a town in the particular stage of Western development that is neither raw frontier nor settled civilization, but something between them, still rough around every edge but with real intentions visible in its infrastructure. The main street had a hardware store, a general mercantile, a land office, a barber shop that also served as a dentist's office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, the aforementioned boarding house, and a hotel that charged more than most people working cattle could afford. The streets were dirt, the boardwalks uneven, and in July the dust was a constant companion that settled on everything and everyone. Clara walked through it with her eyes open and taking note, not looking at it with the dismayed expression that some Easterners wore when they encountered the West for the first time, but with the careful attention of someone who is already trying to understand whether they can build a life here. "How large is the town?" she asked. 200, maybe 210, Eli said. "Growing, though. The railroad's good for trade. There's ranching, and the silver operation in the hills brings in some commerce. It's not Richmond." "No," she agreed without distaste, "but Richmond was not going to do much for me either." He did not press her on that. Mrs. Aldane's boarding house was a white-painted 2-story building with a front porch, where 2 of the current residents were playing cards in the late afternoon shade. Mrs. Aldane herself was a woman of perhaps 55 who had the look of someone who had survived considerable difficulty and emerged from it with both her practicality and her warmth fully intact. She met them at the door, looked at Clara, looked at Eli, looked at the flowers, and took exactly 3 seconds to understand enough of the situation. "Come in out of that heat," she said to Clara. "Mr. Calloway, thank you for bringing her. Will you stay for supper?" "I need to get those supplies back to the ranch before dark," Eli said, "but I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Aldane." He set Clara's trunk inside the door. He looked at Clara and she looked back at him, and there was a moment that sat between them like a question neither of them had formulated yet. "I hope the town turns out to be better than your arrival in it," he said. "It has already produced one kindness," she said quietly and looked down briefly at the flowers. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Genuinely." He touched his hat brim and walked back out into the fading July afternoon, and he was halfway down the street before he realized that he felt something he had not felt in a considerable time, which was the particular keen awareness of a direction he wanted to walk back toward. He did not go back that evening. He had a job to do, and he did it, driving the supply wagon out to the Hadley Ranch in the last light of the afternoon, unloading the hardware with 2 other hands, eating the supper that the ranch cook, a taciturn man named Burrell, set out at 7 o'clock. He lay in his bunk that night in the long bunkhouse with the other hands, and stared at the darkness and thought about brown eyes that had done the mathematics of disappointment so quietly, and about a woman who had answered an advertisement and traveled hundreds of miles and arrived to find nothing waiting for her, and who had nevertheless taken a bunch of wildflowers from a stranger with something that looked, when the composure slipped for just a moment, very like gratitude for being seen. He was back in Dustcreek 4 days later on ranch business, collecting a blacksmith order for Mr. Hadley, and he told himself the entire 3-mile ride in that he was not going specifically to see if Clara Voss was still at Mrs. Aldane's, and had not already taken the next train east. He told himself this with the cheerful dishonesty that men deploy when they already know the truth but are not quite ready to admit it. He completed his business at the blacksmith's shop, which took the better part of an hour, and then he walked, with entirely casual purpose, down Main Street to the general mercantile, which happened to be next door to Mrs. Aldane's boarding house, and he was standing at the mercantile's front counter asking about a spool of wire fence that Hadley needed when the door opened behind him and Clara Voss came in. She was dressed differently today, a lighter dress in a warm cream color, and her hair was still up but more loosely than before. She was carrying a small list in her hand, the focused expression of a woman with specific intentions. She saw him and stopped, and then something in her face moved into something that was unmistakably pleased. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Voss," he said. "How are you settling?" "Better than I expected," she said. "Mrs. Aldane is a remarkable woman. She has already found me a situation." "A situation?" "She knows a family on the north side of town, the Hargreaves. They need someone to help manage the household and tutor their 2 children. It is not what I had planned, but it is honest work and it allows me to stay without running through my savings." "That's good news," Eli said and meant it, and also felt something underneath the good news, which was relief that she was staying, which he had not been certain he was allowed to feel. She moved to the counter and consulted her list and spoke with the storekeeper about a few household items. Eli finished his business with the wire fence spool and should have left, but he found himself waiting near the door with no logical reason to be doing so. When she had completed her purchases and turned toward the door, he was still there. "I was about to walk to the bakery on 2nd Street, she said, with the precise, careful tone of someone extending an invitation without the vulnerability of making it explicit. "If you know it, and if you have no particular urgency." "I have no particular urgency," he said. The bakery was a small establishment run by a German immigrant named Werner Schultz, who had somehow convinced the Southern Plains to want his bread, and who had recently begun making coffee that Eli considered the best in a 3-county radius. They sat at the 2 stools at the small counter near the window, and Werner brought them coffee without being asked, because Werner believed coffee was something people should simply have, and they talked. She had grown up in Richmond in a family of modest means. Her father had been a school teacher. Her mother had died when Clara was 16. She had 2 brothers, both older, both married, and neither one had a spare room or much inclination to complicate their lives with an unmarried sister. She had worked as a seamstress, and then as a governess, and then, at 24, had made the decision that the East was not going to give her the space she needed to build something of her own, and had answered Arthur Prewitt's advertisement with the pragmatic clarity of a woman who understood that romance and practicality were not always separable. "I don't want you to think I was foolish," she said, looking at her coffee cup. "I read his letters carefully. He seemed decent, practical. He did not make impossible promises." "I don't think you were foolish," Eli said flatly. "He was, for leaving without a word." She looked at him with an expression that was briefly, nakedly grateful for the confirmation. "What about you?" she asked. He told her about Missouri, where he had been born in 1855 to a farming family that had lost its land in the chaos following the war, about drifting south and west in his early 20s, doing whatever work was available, driving cattle, repairing fences, hauling freight. About arriving in Texas 3 years ago and finding in the landscape something that answered a longing he hadn't known he had. About Mr. Hadley, who was a fair employer and paid on time, which was not universal. About 7 months on the ranch and the tentative, cautious sense that he might be in the right place to finally stop moving. "You sound like a man who's been looking for something," she said. "Most people are," he said. "What do you think you're looking for?" He considered the question with genuine attention, which she seemed to appreciate, the fact that he did not give her a quick, deflective answer. "Something worth staying for," he said at last. The afternoon had gone gold by the time they left the bakery, and Eli had to ride back to the ranch before full dark, which he did, and he was aware the whole ride back of the way the day had felt different from the 7 months that had preceded it, wider somehow, as though a window had been opened. He found reasons to come into Dustcreek every week. This was not difficult because ranch business generated legitimate errands, and Mr. Hadley, who was an observant man, said nothing except to note once that the hardware and supplies were being maintained to a higher standard of regularity than they had been the previous year. He and Clara developed a habit of meeting at Werner's bakery when he came to town, which began as accidental and quickly became understood by both of them as intentional, without either of them having explicitly said so. This was the particular courtship grammar of the frontier, where directness in practical matters coexisted with a great circumspection about the heart, where two people could build something real and fragile and full of feeling, while nominally discussing coffee and the progress of the Hargreaves children's reading lessons. She was teaching the Hargreaves boy, who was 8, to read, and the girl, who was 6, to do sums, and she had views about education that were thoughtful and specific. She believed children learned better when the material connected to things they already cared about, and she had begun teaching the boy to read using accounts of cattle drives and maps of Texas, which had produced, according to Mrs. Hargreaves, who passed this information to Mrs. Aldane, who mentioned it to Eli one afternoon with unconcealed satisfaction, a remarkable improvement in his engagement. "You like teaching," Eli said to her one afternoon in late August, when the heat had begun to relent the smallest amount and the evenings were coming slightly earlier. "I like watching someone understand something they didn't understand before," she said. "There's a moment when it arrives in their face. It's one of the best things to witness." "You could teach school," he said. "The church building doubles as the schoolroom, but there's no regular teacher. Reverend Poole handles it when he can, but he has told anyone who will listen that he is a minister and not a schoolmaster." She was quiet for a moment. "I had thought of it," she said. "But I don't know if the town would accept a woman in that position, or if anyone with authority over such things would agree to it." "The town council meets the first Monday of each month," Eli said. "I know 2 of the 4 men on it. Neither of them is unreasonable." She looked at him. "Are you proposing to speak on my behalf?" "Only if you'd like me to," he said. "It's your life to arrange." Something about the way he said it, the careful respect in it, the refusal to manage her, made her look at him for a moment longer than she usually did. "I would like that," she said. He spoke to the council. It took 2 meetings and a demonstration lesson with the Hargreaves children serving as the audience, conducted in the church building before 3 of the 4 council members and Reverend Poole, who sat in the front pew looking equal parts relieved and slightly territorial. Clara taught a lesson on geography and arithmetic simultaneously, using a hand-drawn map of Texas and a series of problems about distances between towns, and she did it with such calm authority and evident skill that even Reverend Poole, who had initially been doubtful about the propriety of a young, unmarried woman holding the position, admitted afterward that the children had been more attentive in 40 minutes than they had ever been in his care. The council voted 3-1 to offer Clara the position of Dustcreek's first permanent school teacher, with a salary paid quarterly and the use of the church building on weekdays. The dissenting vote came from a man named Holloway, who objected on principle to women in professional positions and said so loudly enough that Clara, waiting outside, heard him, and Eli, standing near the door, watched her absorb it without flinching and without diminishing, and felt something he would later try to find words for, which was a kind of fierce and specific admiration for the quality of her composure. She accepted the position with simple grace, and a thank you that was warmer than professional gratitude and cooler than personal victory, which was the exact right temperature. They walked back down Main Street afterward in the warm September evening, and Eli felt the weight of something building between them that had been building for weeks and was becoming harder to continue walking alongside without addressing. "Are you pleased?" he asked. "I am very pleased," she said, and there was light in it, real and uncalculated, and she turned to look at him while they were walking, and the evening light was behind her, and he thought she was, simply and entirely, the most interesting and fine-looking woman he had ever spent time with, and that thought sat in him like a warm stone. "Clara," he said, and using her first name meant something and they both knew it. Eli, she returned, with just the ghost of humor at the corner of her mouth. I'd like to court you, he said, properly, with your full knowledge and consent and not through the pretense of needing coffee on a regular basis. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, unguarded, the first truly unguarded thing he had heard from her, and it was like a door opening into a room he very much wanted to be in. I was wondering how long before you said it plainly, she said. I've been working up to it for about 6 weeks. I know, she said. I've noticed the pattern of your trips to town becoming remarkably consistent. Is that a yes? She stopped walking and turned to face him fully on the evening street of Dustcreek, Texas, with the dust settling and the lamps beginning to come on in the windows up and down Main Street, and said, That is most definitely a yes. He walked her back to Mrs. Aldine's boarding house and stood on the porch steps, and they talked for another hour about nothing urgent, about Missouri and Virginia, and the smell of rain on prairie grass, and whether Werner Schultz would ever expand his bakery into something larger. And at 9 o'clock she went inside, and he rode back to the ranch in the full dark, and he was grinning for the whole 3 miles without being aware of it until he arrived and Burl, who was smoking on the bunkhouse steps, looked at him and said, You look like a fool. I might be, Eli said cheerfully and went to bed. The courtship of Eli Calloway and Clara Voss proceeded in the way that courtships in frontier towns do, which is to say, with a mixture of tenderness and practicality, and the constant awareness that in small communities privacy is a courtesy people grant you rather than a condition that exists naturally. Mrs. Aldine approved of Eli with the decisive satisfaction of a woman who had made the assessment quickly and needed no revision. The Hargreaves family was pleased on Clara's behalf, and let this be known. Werner Schultz refilled their coffee cups without charge when they came in together on Sunday afternoons, which was the only outward sign of sentiment he ever displayed, but which they understood to be considerable. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons when Eli could get the time, sometimes just to the edge of town where the prairie opened up, and you could see 20 miles in every direction, the grass gone gold and silver in the September light, the sky so large it adjusted your sense of your own proportion in the world. Clara had learned to ride adequately before coming west, and she sat a horse with careful determination that improved week by week, and Eli taught her, patient and specific in his instruction, never making her feel clumsy, always attentive to what she could already do. On one of these afternoons in early October, they sat on a low rise and watched a hawk circle over the grass below, and Clara said, I want to tell you something I haven't told anyone here. He waited. I came out here partly because of Arthur Pruitt's advertisement, she said, but partly because I needed to leave Richmond. My father passed away in the spring. The house was sold. There was nothing to go back to. The brothers I mentioned, they are decent men, but their wives are not particularly warm toward me. I had the feeling that if I stayed in Richmond I would become a burden they never quite complained about but always felt. I couldn't bear that. There's no shame in what you did, he said. I know that, she said, and the steadiness in it told him she had arrived at that knowledge through effort rather than having it come easily. But sometimes I wonder what I would have done if things had gone differently. If Pruitt had been here, if it had worked, would it have made you happy? She considered this with genuine honesty. I think I would have been comfortable and useful and not unhappy, she said. I don't know if I would have been happy. I think happy was something I wasn't quite permitting myself to aim for. Eli looked out at the hawk circling in the long light. What changed? He asked quietly. She was quiet for a moment. Someone spent their last coin on a flower, she said. He looked at her. It wasn't the flower, she continued. Or not only the flower, it was that you looked at me and saw that I was there. That I had arrived somewhere and no one acknowledged it, and you made it a point to acknowledge it. I had been so prepared for indifference that the opposite of it was almost startling. He said nothing for a moment because there were things that required space rather than immediate response. I didn't do it to be remarkable, he said at last. I know, she said. That's the part that mattered. October moved into November and the temperature on the high plains shifted, the nights turning sharp and the days brisk and bright. Clara's school had opened formally at the beginning of October with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she had organized them with the same combination of warmth and specific authority that she brought to everything. And by November, 3 more families had enrolled children who had previously been learning whatever they could from whoever had time. She had requisitioned, through the town council, a modest supply of primers and slates, which arrived via the Southern Pacific in 3 wooden crates, and on the day they came she was at the depot to receive them personally, and Eli, who had made it his business to be there, helped her carry them to the church building and watched her open the crates with the careful eagerness of someone receiving something they have been hungry for. "Books," she said, lifting a primer and holding it with both hands. "Books," he agreed, smiling. "You think I'm being excessive about books." "I think you are being exactly the right amount about books," he said. She looked at him over the top of the primer. "Eli Calloway," she said, "you are an unusually good man." "I've been told I have my moments," he said, and she laughed and put the primer down on a desk and crossed the room and kissed him, quickly and deliberately and with complete intentionality, and it was the first time she had kissed him, and he stood very still for a moment after she stepped back because he was trying to make sure of what had just happened. "Was that acceptable?" she asked, with careful lightness covering genuine vulnerability. "That was considerably more than acceptable," he said, and crossed the distance between them and kissed her in return, slowly and without haste, and she put her hand against his jaw, and he put his hand against her back, and the primers sat in their opened crates, and the November light came through the church windows, and Dustcreek continued its business outside, entirely indifferent to the fact that 2 of its residents had just decided, without any further need for deliberation, that they were in love. He asked her to marry him on the first Sunday of December. He had been considering how to do it for several weeks, and had rejected various approaches as either too elaborate or too plain, and had finally decided that the right occasion was a place rather than a production. He took her on their usual Sunday ride and guided them to a spot he had found in November, a bend in a dry creek about 2 miles north of town, where a stand of cottonwoods had shed their leaves in bright yellow, and some of them were still caught in the branches, so that the whole stand was threaded with gold, and the dry creek bed had smooth, pale stones in it. And on a clear December afternoon, it was the most beautiful thing in the near vicinity of Dustcreek. He told her he loved her first, standing among the cottonwoods with their horses grazing behind them, because he wanted that to exist separately from the proposal, to have its own ground. "I love you," he said, simply and without preamble. "I have known it for some time, and I want you to know it clearly." She looked at him with the full weight of her attention and said, "I love you. I have known it since October, and I have been waiting for a reasonable moment to say so without ambushing you." "You could have said it at any point. I would not have considered it an ambush." "Noted," she said, warm with humor. And then he said, "Will you marry me, Clara?" "Not because it's practical, though it may be. Not because it's expected, though it might be. Because I want to spend all the days I have with you, specifically you, in this place that I think we can both make a home of. Because you are the most real and fine person I have encountered, and I do not want to imagine what this country looks like without you in it." She did not make him wait for an answer. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He had no ring to give her yet, which he told her honestly, and she said the ring was not the point, and he said it mattered to him nevertheless, and she said very well, but it is not a condition, and he said he understood that, and she took his hand and held it, and they stood among the gold cottonwoods while the December light angled long and low across the plain. He bought the ring in January from a traveling jeweler who came through Dustcreek on his circuit, and offered a modest but genuine gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, which Eli selected because the blue of the stone was the blue of a Texas sky, and it seemed to him the right thing to carry with her from this place. He paid for it with 3 months of carefully saved wages, and when he put it on her finger she looked at it for a long time in the quiet way she had with things that moved her. They were married in March of 1884 at the Dustcreek church, which had been swept clean and decorated with whatever early spring wildflowers Mrs. Alden and several other women had been able to gather from the edges of the road and the creek beds, so that the plain wooden interior was made briefly and genuinely beautiful. Reverend Poole performed the ceremony with evident pleasure, his ambivalence about a female schoolteacher having been thoroughly dissolved by several months of watching Dustcreek's children improve in ways that reflected well on the whole community. The congregation was small. Mrs. Alden in the front pew with a handkerchief she used extensively, the Hargreaves family, Werner Schultz, who had closed the bakery for the first time anyone could remember, 4 other ranch hands from Hadley's, Eli's employer, Mr. Hadley himself, a weathered man of 60 who shook Eli's hand before the ceremony with a grip that communicated more than words and said only, "Good man," which from Hadley was an oration. Clara had written to her 2 brothers in Richmond. One had sent a brief but genuine note of congratulations. The other had not replied. She had folded the one note and kept it and not remarked further on the absent one, and Eli had watched her process this with the same self-contained grace she brought to all disappointments, and had loved her more for it. She wore a dress of ivory muslin that she had made herself over 3 weeks of evenings at Mrs. Alden's, with small blue embroidery at the cuffs and collar that she had added late in the process because, she said, a wedding dress should not be entirely modest. She carried a small bunch of spring flowers that Eli had gathered from the creek that morning, because it seemed right to begin where they had begun, with flowers and with intention. When Reverend Poole said, "You may kiss your bride," Eli cupped her face in his rough-edged hands and kissed her in the full light of the church, and the congregation made the sounds people make when something they have been hoping for arrives as beautiful as they expected. They took up residence in a rented house on the western edge of Dustcreek, 2 rooms with a good kitchen, and a porch facing west where the sunsets were genuinely spectacular. Eli had negotiated a slightly better arrangement with Mr. Hadley, less time in the bunkhouse, and a small monthly addition to his wages in recognition of 7 months of reliable work, which combined with Clara's teacher's salary gave them what they needed and a small amount beyond it, enough to begin saving toward something larger. The first months of the marriage were the particular revelation that early marriages are, the discovery that the person you have loved and courted is richer and stranger, and more surprising than the person you met, because love in proximity has dimensions that courtship across distance cannot reveal. Eli discovered that Clara sang quietly to herself in the kitchen in the mornings, half-remembered hymns from childhood mixed with songs he did not recognize, and that she could not sleep if there was a book she had not finished, and that she had opinions about the quality of cornbread that were strong and specific and entirely correct. Clara discovered that Eli was a man who repaired things without being asked, who would spend an entire Sunday afternoon rebuilding a fence post that was only slightly tilted because it bothered him to leave things at a lean, and who had a habit of standing in the doorway on clear nights looking at the stars with an expression that was not sadness but not quite contentment either, something further along, something like peace that is still examining itself. She came and stood beside him one April night when the sky was extraordinary, the Milky Way a white river across the black. "What are you thinking about when you stand here?" she asked. "How large it is," he said. "And how that used to make me feel small, and now it makes me feel like there's room for everything." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the doorway together looking at the stars, while the warm south wind moved through the grass and the town of Dustcreek slept. "I think there is room for everything," she said quietly. He held her closer. "I believe you're right." The spring of 1884 brought news that had been anticipated, but arrived with impact regardless. The silver operation in the hills northwest of town had struck a significantly richer vein than previously estimated, and the resulting activity was going to bring new settlers and new commerce to Dustcreek in numbers that would change its character. The town council convened in urgent session and began discussing matters of expansion, infrastructure, land registration, and the question of a real schoolhouse rather than the shared church building, which with a growing population would soon be inadequate for both purposes. Clara presented a formal proposal to the council in May, the first time a woman had done so in the council's 4-year history, and she did it with the preparation and precision of someone who had spent considerable time understanding what men in positions of authority respond to. She had cost figures, enrollment projections, a proposed building plan obtained from a carpenter in San Antonio, whose work she had corresponded with by letter, and a comparison of 3 other West Texas towns that had invested in dedicated schoolhouses and seen immediate improvements in enrollment, teacher retention, and overall civic stability. The council voted 4-0. Holloway, the man who had been the dissenting vote on her original appointment, was not present at this meeting, having removed himself to the hotel's saloon, which he did when he anticipated a meeting going in a direction he disapproved of, a strategy that removed his obstruction without requiring him to change his views. Eli built the schoolhouse. This is perhaps too simple a way to say what actually happened, which was that Eli, using the carpentry knowledge he had accumulated over years of various work, organized and largely directed the building's construction as a community project over the summer of 1884, recruiting 3 other skilled men in town and 3 from the Hadley Ranch, working evenings and full Saturdays through June and July in the relentless Texas summer heat. While Clara kept the water barrel full and brought food at midday and consulted on the placement of windows, which she had strong ideas about, specifically that each wall should have at least 2 to provide adequate light for reading without straining young eyes. The schoolhouse was completed in August, a single large room with properly sized windows on 3 sides, a proper floor of finished pine, a wood stove for winter, and a small storage room at the back. Above the door, Eli had carved into a piece of cedar the word school in even, careful letters, and Clara had stood in front of it with her hand over her mouth and tears in her eyes that she allowed to fall without any pretense of composure, and then turned to him and said, "It's the best thing I have ever seen," and he said, "Better than the flower," and she laughed through the tears and hit him lightly on the shoulder and said, "Almost," and he pulled her in and kissed the top of her head. The school opened in September of 1884 with 23 students, the growth in enrollment reflecting the town's expansion as the silver trade brought new families. Clara hired an assistant, a young woman named Pearl Jennings who had arrived in Dustcreek with her family from Oklahoma and who had, Clara discovered within her first week, a natural aptitude for working with young children and a very large supply of patience. They work together with the ease of 2 people who share fundamental values about what they are doing, and the Dustcreek School became, within 2 years, something the town was quietly proud of. In November of 1884, Clara told Eli she was expecting their first child. She told him on the porch in the evening while they were sitting in the 2 wooden chairs he had made over the summer, and she said it with the particular composed expression she used, when the thing she was saying contained a great deal more feeling than she was currently prepared to display. He looked at her, and then he looked at the western sky where the stars were just beginning to emerge, and then he looked back at her, and everything he was feeling moved across his face without a single effort to contain it. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said, and her composure broke gently and beautifully open, and she was crying and smiling at the same time, and he was out of his chair and beside her, and then she was in his arms and he was holding her with great care, the specific tenderness of a man who understands that the person he is holding is both immensely strong and in this particular moment wanting to be held. "Are you happy?" she asked against his shoulder. "I am so far beyond happy that I need a different word," he said. In June of 1885, their son was born. Eli was there, which was not universal practice among men of the era, but which he had made clear from the first was not negotiable. He held Clara's hand through the long hours and let her squeeze it until the bones ground together and did not make a single sound about it. And when the midwife, a capable woman named Rosa Delgado who had been practicing in the county for 15 years, placed his son in his arms, he held the boy with the uncertain reverence of a man who has not held a newborn before and is aware that he is in the presence of something he has no adequate framework for. "He looks angry," Eli said. "All babies look angry," Rosa told him cheerfully. "It gets better." "What do you want to name him?" Clara asked from the bed, spent and glowing. They had discussed names but made no final decision, because Clara had said the name should be chosen when you saw the face, that sometimes you could not decide the right name for something until you were looking directly at it. Eli looked at the small red face of his son and thought about Missouri and Texas and a coin and a flower, and the way a woman's eyes could reorganize everything you had planned to do with your life. "James," he said. "James Thomas Calloway." "James," Clara said, tasting it. "Yes." James Thomas Calloway was a good baby in the sense that he was demonstrably committed to life from the very first, which Rosa said was a professional assessment, and he grew with the cheerful rapidity of children in warm climates, round and loud, and endlessly interested in everything within his reach. Clara nursed him through the first months with the same focused competence she brought to all physical challenges, and Eli adapted to fatherhood with a naturalness that surprised him. The way the baby became within weeks simply the most important fact in the room, altering the center of gravity of every space he entered. Dustcreek continued to grow. By 1886, the population had crossed 400, and a proper hotel had been built, and the two saloons had been joined by a third establishment that tried to class itself as a restaurant, but was essentially a saloon with better tablecloths. A doctor arrived in 1885, a young man from Ohio named Dr. Mercer who had come west for the frontier medicine experience and stayed because of a local widow, which was a story the town enjoyed telling. A lawyer established an office. A small bank opened. Eli had saved enough by the spring of 1886, with the slightly better wages Hadley paid and Clara's salary, and with the particular thrift of two people who had both grown up understanding the precise relationship between money and security, to make a serious offer on a piece of land. 40 acres, 3 miles east of Dustcreek, on the edge of a shallow river valley, where the soil was better than most of the surrounding county, and there was reliable water. He showed Clara the land on a Sunday afternoon in April, riding out with James asleep against his chest in the carrier. Rosa Delgado had taught Clara to make from heavy cotton, and they walked the perimeter of the 40 acres while James slept and the spring grass was coming in green, and the river moved silver over smooth stones in the valley below. "I want to build us a house here," Eli said. "A proper house, with enough room for the family we're making, and a big porch and space in the barn for 4 horses and room for a garden if you want one." Clara stood at the edge of the valley and looked out across the 40 acres of spring grass. "I want a garden," she said. "Then you'll have a garden, and fruit trees if the soil will take them. I'll plant whatever will grow." She turned to look at him, and James stirred against his chest and made a small sound of unconscious contentment. "Eli," she said, "do you understand that everything you have done since the day we met has been exactly right?" "I've made mistakes," he said. "Of course you have, but the things that mattered you got right." He looked at her in the April light, his wife, with their son asleep against his chest and 40 acres of spring grass around them. "I had help," he said quietly. "You made it easy to get things right." She came to him and leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the sleeping James, and he put his free arm around her, and they stood in the river valley while the spring moved through the grass. He purchased the land in May of 1886 and began building in June, and this time the project was properly his own. though several men from town contributed weekends and evenings the way that communities do when they have decided that someone's home is a shared investment in the character of the place. The Hadley Ranch hands came on the first Saturday and they made the frame, and Werner Schultz came and brought bread and coffee and sat on a stack of lumber and watched with the satisfied expression of a man who considers community construction a form of art. Clara designed the interior with the same attention she had given the schoolhouse windows, thinking about light and the movement of air in summer heat, about the way a room should feel to a person coming in from hard work, about where a child would play and where two people would sit in the evenings and talk. She had, over 2 years of teaching, developed a facility for the organization of space that was partly instinct and partly the product of thinking constantly about how people inhabit the places they are given. The house was finished in October of 1886, a white-sided frame house with a covered porch running the full length of the front, 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up, with a kitchen that was properly large and a parlor that had room for the 2 rocking chairs from the porch of the rented house, and eventually a small bookcase that Eli built and Clara filled. There was a barn, not large but solid, with 4 stalls and a good hayloft. The garden was prepared but not planted, because Clara said you planted a garden in spring, and there was no sense rushing it. They moved in on a Saturday in late October and slept in their own house for the first time that night, James in his small bed in the room that had been designed for him, with the window facing east so that the morning light would come in gently, and Eli and Clara in their room with the west-facing window and the view of the valley below. She lay awake for a while after Eli had gone to sleep, listening to the house settle around them, and she thought about the Richmond she had left, the small crowded rooms and the feeling of being an inconvenience in other people's lives, and about the platform at Dustcreek Station in July 1883, and about a man with a worn coin and a bunch of wildflowers, and about how entirely improbable it was that this was where that moment had led. She put her hand flat on the bed beside her, and he was asleep, but he moved toward the warmth of her hand in his sleep without waking, the instinctive movement of a body that has learned to find its particular person, and she smiled in the dark of their house on their 40 acres in Texas and went to sleep. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was hard across the Texas plains, one of the coldest on record, the kind of winter that the cattle industry would remember for a generation because of the losses it caused on the great ranges to the north. Dustcreek suffered less than some places because the river valley provided some shelter, and the town had developed enough commerce to not be entirely dependent on cattle. But it was cold, and it was long, and in February the school was closed for 2 weeks because 6 of the enrolled children were sick with a respiratory illness that swept through the town. Dr. Mercer worked without adequate rest for the duration of the illness, and Clara worked alongside him, not as a nurse but as a practical organizer, coordinating the preparation of broth and the keeping of warm compresses among the households with sick children, visiting each family on a daily circuit she maintained even in the worst cold. No one died, which Mercer said later was partly medicine and partly Eli Calloway, and he would not assign exact proportions. James, who was 19 months old, had a mild version of the illness and recovered in a week, cared for round the clock by both his parents with the intensity that parents of young children bring to any real threat, and when he was well again and back on his feet in the house, pulling things off low surfaces with renewed energetic determination, Clara sat down in the kitchen and put her hands over her face and allowed herself to feel, for about 5 minutes, all the fear she had been containing and not showing for a week, and then she lowered her hands and made coffee and went about the day. Eli found her in the kitchen when he came in from the barn, and he knew from 20-some months of close attention to her what the last 5 minutes had contained. He sat down across from her and said nothing, and she looked at him across the kitchen table. "He's all right," she said. "He's perfectly all right, Eli confirmed. "I know he is. I am just—" She stopped. "I know," he said. And he did know, which was one of the things about the marriage that she returned to, in moments of reflection, as something almost astonishing. The way he knew, not in the generic way of people who claim to understand, but in the specific, practical, particular way of a man who has paid attention to every instance of this specific woman over a span of years, and built from that attention a genuine map of her interior. Spring came back, as it does, indifferent to the damage it follows, with exactly the same green and the same light. Clara planted her garden in April, and it turned out that the soil in the river valley was excellent, and by August she had tomatoes and cucumbers and squash, and a row of sunflowers along the fence that James, now 2 and old enough to have opinions about beauty, declared his favorite thing on the property. Better than the horses? Eli asked him. James considered this with the seriousness of a 2-year-old confronting a genuinely difficult choice. "The flowers are very yellow," he said, which was not a resolution but was very representative of him. "That's true," Eli agreed, and caught Clara's eye across the garden, and she was trying not to laugh, and he was trying not to laugh, and James was absolutely earnest in his assessment of the flowers, and it was one of those small domestic moments that carry an outsized weight of happiness. In 1887, Eli bought 5 more acres adjoining the original 40, which brought a good spring that had been on the edge of the first parcel fully onto his property. He had begun keeping a small cattle operation alongside his horse work, a modest herd of 12 that he was slowly building through careful selection, and the additional spring water was important for the summer months when the river ran lower. He continued working for Hadley 2 days a week, partly for the income and partly because he was by nature a man who valued the structure of regular work. But the balance had shifted toward his own land, and Mr. Hadley, who was aging towards 70 now and had no children of his own, had begun speaking to Eli in a way that suggested the possibility of a future arrangement that both of them understood without fully articulating. Clara's school had 28 students by the fall of 1887, and she and Pearl Jennings had developed a curriculum that was the most structured in the county, which had been noted by the county school board when they conducted their annual review, and which resulted in a small increase in the funding allocated to Dustcreek School. Clara used the additional funds to purchase a proper globe, a large map of the United States, a supply of writing paper, and a set of simple instruments for a lesson in practical mathematics that she was developing. She also began, in the evenings after supper, writing a small curriculum guide, her own structured approach to the teaching of literacy and arithmetic in frontier communities, practical, experience-based, addressing the particular challenges of mixed-age classrooms and the variable prior learning that children in small western towns brought with them. She wrote it in a clear ledger at the kitchen table while Eli read or mended something, or, increasingly, simply sat nearby in the companionable way of 2 people who have learned that being in the same room is itself a form of conversation. "You should send that to the county superintendent," he said one evening, watching her write. "It is not finished. When it is finished, it is a guide for teachers in places like Dustcreek. I am not sure the county superintendent requires it." "I am not sure you are right about that," he said. She looked up at him. "You always think my work matters," she said. "It always does. You are not unbiased." "No, but I am not wrong." She looked at him for a moment with the full warmth of her. "I'll send it when it's done," she said. In the autumn of 1888, Clara told Eli she was expecting again. He was in the barn when she told him, which he always found slightly funny in retrospect, that both major pieces of news in their marriage had been delivered in ordinary domestic settings, the first on the porch with stars coming out, the second in the barn with the smell of hay and 2 horses watching with the mild curiosity of large animals who find human drama faintly interesting. He put down the bridle he was oiling and turned to face her, and she was standing in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind her, and she was 29 now and had been hardened and softened in equal measure by 5 years in Texas, and she was, as she had been in every version of herself that he had witnessed, entirely herself, fully and without apology. "You are going to tell me you are happy about this," she said. "I am incandescently happy about this," he said. "Good," she said. "Because it is happening." He crossed the barn and picked her up, which made her laugh and protest about dignity, and he set her down and kissed her, and the 2 horses returned to their hay. In April of 1889 their second child was born, another boy which Eli greeted with the uncomplicated joy of a man who had neither expectation nor preference, only the enormous relief of a healthy child and a healthy wife. This time the name came faster. "Will," Clara said before Eli could speak. "William, for my father." He looked at the small face and said, "William Calloway." "Yes, good." "William James Calloway," she amended because she wanted both names present. "William James Calloway," he confirmed, and held his second son with the greater confidence of a man who has done this before and knows how to hold what is small and essential. James, who was 3½ was brought to meet his brother the following morning and stood at the bedside with the serious deliberation of someone conducting an important assessment. "He is smaller than I expected," James reported. "He will grow," Clara said. "Does he know things?" "Not yet. You can teach him." James considered this responsibility. "I can teach him about the sunflowers," he said finally. "That would be an excellent beginning," Clara said. Eli was standing in the doorway of the bedroom watching his wife and his older son discuss the educational prospects of the new baby, and the morning light was coming in the east window the way Clara had designed it to, falling gently on all 3 of them, and he held this image with the full attention of a man who has learned the hard way that good things deserve to be noticed. The summer of 1889 was long and hot and full of the ordinary richness of a life that has found its proper shape. The garden came in abundantly. The cattle herd had grown to 22. Eli had taken on a young man named Daniel to help with the ranch work, a quiet 20-year-old from New Mexico who was good with horses and grateful for steady work. Clara returned to teaching in September, leaving William in the care of Mrs. Aldane, who had retired from the boarding house in 1887, but who had made absolutely clear that she expected to be involved in the Calloway children's care in whatever capacity was useful, and who kept William 3 mornings a week with the focused devotion of a grandmother who is not related by blood, but has decided this is a detail. The curriculum guide was finished in the fall of 1889, and Clara sent it to the county school superintendent, who responded 6 weeks later with a letter saying that he had read it with considerable interest and had forwarded a copy to the State Board of Education in Austin. This information arrived at the same time as a letter from Clara's brother in Richmond, the one who had not responded to the wedding announcement, who wrote now with a careful apology for his silence and news that his wife had died of fever in the summer, and he was uncertain about everything and thought perhaps he had not handled certain things well over the years. Clara read this letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. "What will you write back?" Eli asked. "The truth," she said, "that I forgive him, that people do foolish things when they are afraid and it does not make them irredeemable, that he is welcome to write. And if he wants to come out here," she considered. "Then he would be welcome to do that too," she said. "This is a place people can come to and start over. I know because I did." Eli reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "You did more than start over," he said. "You built something." "We built something," she corrected. In 1890, the county superintendent wrote to invite Clara to present her curriculum guide at a regional educators conference in San Antonio, the first such conference to include a formal presentation by a woman in the record of the organization. She took the train to San Antonio in April and stood before 46 teachers from across West Texas and spoke for 30 minutes about literacy instruction in mixed-age frontier classrooms. and she spoke with the same combination of warmth and specific authority she had always used. And at the end, there was a silence that was not indifference, but the particular quiet of people absorbing something that has changed how they think about their work. She came home to Dustcreek on the evening train on a Thursday, and Eli was at the station with both boys, James, who was 5 and walking beside him with great dignity, and William, who was 1 and riding on Eli's hip with the boneless ease of a toddler. And when she stepped off the train and saw them there, all 3 of them waiting for her in the last light of the April evening, she stopped on the platform steps for a moment that she did not try to hurry. This was so different from that other arrival. This was everything that arrival had not been. There was Eli's face, which was simply the face she loved most in the world. There was James, who was already calling her name Mama, Mama, running the last 3 paces with his arms out. There was small William turning his head toward her, voice reaching. She came down the steps and went to them. Eli kissed her and said, "How did it go?" "I think I said everything I meant to say," she said. "That's all you can do." They were quiet at the end, the good kind. "I never doubted it," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's one of the things I love most about you." James was pulling at her hand with important news about something that had happened while she was away. A circumstance involving a rabbit that had gotten into the garden and the heroic countermeasures he had deployed. And Eli was listening to this account with appropriate gravity. And William had transferred himself from Eli's hip to Clara's arms with practiced efficiency. And they walked off the Dustcreek platform together into the April evening, the 4 of them. And the spring dark came in around them, and the stars opened over the plain. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, each one distinct and full and complete in its own terms, and the Calloway property on the edge of the river valley became a defined thing in the county, a name on maps, a place people knew. Eli bought the last 12 acres of the old Hadley Ranch when Mr. Hadley died in 1892, which he had known was coming, and which had been arranged through a legal document that Mr. Hadley had prepared with a lawyer in 1890. He received the deed at the land office on a Tuesday morning and came home and told Clara that afternoon, and she said, "Old Mr. Hadley believed in you from the beginning," and Eli said, "He was a fair man," and they were quiet for a moment for a person they had both respected. Daniel, the ranch hand from New Mexico, had proved so reliable and so good with the cattle that by 1892 Eli was paying him a wage that reflected a real partnership in the operation. And Daniel, who had in the interim married Pearl Jennings, Clara's teaching assistant, in a development that both families considered entirely satisfying, had become a fixed part of the life of the place. Pearl continued to teach at Dustcreek School alongside Clara until 1894, when her first child arrived, and she needed to reduce her hours. By then the school had 35 students, and had produced its first class of young people who had received the full 8 years of education that Clara had designed, and several of them had gone on to secondary schooling in San Antonio, and one young man, the son of a German settler who had come with the silver boom, had been admitted to a college in Austin, which Clara received as a piece of news with an emotion she described to Eli as the professional equivalent of watching a seed become a tree. In 1894, a daughter arrived. Clara told Eli on the porch this time deliberately, because she had come to appreciate the symmetry of telling him important things in the place where they had begun their evenings together for 8 years, and the October evening was mild and golden, and James was 9, and William was 5, and both of them were inside doing their lessons with the focused reluctance of children who would rather be outside. "A third," she said. He was quiet for the length of a deep breath, and then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well." "Good," he said. "Good." He paused. Three, she confirmed, watching him. "That's a family," he said. "We already were a family." "A bigger family," he said. "A more considerable family," she laughed. "You're pleased," she said. "Clara," he said, looking at her with the full directness that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, the quality of his attention, I have been pleased about every single thing that has happened in the last 11 years since I met you. This is not a departure from that record. In April of 1895, Josephine Clara Calloway was born. Eli held his daughter for the first time with the hands of a man who had now done this 3 times and knew how, and looked at her small and complete face, and said, "Hello, Josie." And she opened her eyes and looked back at him with the unseeing focus of a newborn, and he was, as he had been on both previous occasions, made briefly and thoroughly speechless by the fact of her. James was 10 and took his role as eldest with characteristic seriousness. William, who was 6, was fascinated by Josie with a tenderness that expressed itself mostly in standing very close to her, and looking at her with wide eyes, and occasionally offering her objects she was not yet capable of using. Clara, watching her second son's quiet devotion to his new sister, thought of her own father and felt him present in the room in some way she could not explain, but did not want to dismiss. The spring of 1895 was full and abundant. The garden was its best yet. The cattle herd had settled at a productive number. Daniel had the routine of the ranch in a competent and organized management. Eli built a new fence along the river boundary with James helping on the weekends. And Clara, recovered from the birth and back to her full force by June, returned to the school and to the curriculum work that had grown into a regular correspondence with educators in 4 counties. On a Sunday evening in June of 1895, the whole family was on the porch in the warm dark, the boys playing a quiet game of some kind on the steps, Josie asleep in Clara's arms. The river valley below the house was full of frogs, and the first fireflies had appeared in the grass, and Eli was sitting beside Clara in the chair he had made for himself 12 years ago, which had been repaired twice and was never going to be replaced. Clara looked out at the fireflies moving in the dark grass below the porch and said, "Do you remember the flower?" He looked at her. "I remember everything," he said. "That 1 cent," she said. "I have thought about it more times than I could count." "What would have happened if you had not done that?" "I have thought about it too. The boy was going to leave," she said. "He was just about to go, you stopped him, you spent what you had." "It was only a cent," he said. "It was everything you had." "Everything I had at that particular moment," he said. "I have had considerably more since." She looked at him with the long, full, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who knows exactly who she is looking at and has never once stopped being glad of it. "Thank you," she said. "Clara, I mean it. 11 years later, and I mean it exactly as much as I did on that platform." He reached over and took her hand, careful of the sleeping Josie, and held it the way he had learned to hold things that were essential, with the full and quiet attention of a man who understands their value. The fireflies moved through the Texas dark below them. The boys' voices were low and content on the steps. Josie breathed in her mother's arms. The river valley was full of sound, the frogs and the crickets and the slow water over stones, and the sky above the plain was enormous and full of stars. The same sky that Eli had stood under in the doorways of rented rooms and bunkhouses, and finally his own house, and felt become gradually less a thing to be measured against and more a thing to live within. James came up the steps and leaned against his father's shoulder with the easy familiarity of a 10-year-old who has never had reason to doubt his welcome, and Eli put his arm around him and the boy settled in, looking out at the fireflies. "What are you and your mother talking about?" James asked. "Old stories," Eli said. "Tell me one." Eli looked at Clara and she looked at him, and there was a private language in it that was 11 years in the making and would be growing for as long as they were making it together. "All right," Eli said. "It starts in the summer on a train platform, and there's a woman arriving somewhere new and nobody's come to meet her." James turned his face up toward his father with the particular alertness of a child who can tell when a story is real. "What happens?" he asked. "A man sees her standing there," Eli said, "and he has 1 coin left in his pocket." And instead of keeping it for tomorrow, which might have been the sensible thing, he spends it on a flower from a boy at the edge of the platform. And he walks over and gives it to her and says, "Welcome." James considered this. "Why?" he asked. Eli was quiet for a moment, looking out at the fireflies, feeling the weight of his son against his side and his daughter's sleeping breath from the next chair, and the warm, steady presence of the woman who had been every version of herself fully and without diminishment, in every year they had shared. "Because," he said, "nobody ought to arrive somewhere new without something decent to look at. And because sometimes the most important decision you ever make is not the one you planned. Sometimes it's the one that just asks to be made right then, and you either make it or you don't." James thought about this for a long time. Was the woman happy she got the flower, he asked. "She was," Eli said. "Eventually she was very happy indeed." James seemed satisfied by this resolution and went back down the steps to his brother. And Eli and Clara sat in the warm Texas night with their daughter asleep between them and the stars overhead and the fireflies riding their small lights through the dark grass of their valley. And there was nothing missing from the moment, nothing absent, nothing unresolved, nothing left to wish for except what they already had, which was considerable, which was everything, which was more than a worn coin and a wildflower could have predicted, and exactly what they had together, with great care and clear eyes and the daily renewable decision to choose each other, built. The frogs sang on. The river moved. The stars held their positions in the enormous Texas sky. James taught his brother something about fireflies, his voice carrying up to the porch in the warm dark. Josie slept, and Clara leaned her head very slightly toward Eli, and he moved his chair the necessary inch, and the evening held them all in its long, good dark, and Dustcreek settled into its night, and the plain lay open in every direction under the stars, and this was their life, whole and complete and entirely their own.